The first time the jug's prop washed cold air over Jack Harlan's boots. The morning smelled like wet concrete and hot coffee. Debden was still half asleep. Only the Aldous lamps and the line shack woke before the English sun. He stood on the wing root of a brand new P-47D-5, bare metal under flaking primer, cowling stripes not yet painted, and ran his palm across the tight curve of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800. "Big girl," he said to no one, and the crew chief grinned without looking up. "Big and thirsty," the chief said, cinching the cowling fasteners. "But she'll bring you home with half the cylinders sulking." Inside the revetment, 8 Brownings waited like a promise. Jack slid into the cockpit, and the aircraft swallowed him in round smells. Rubber, oil, cordite that wasn't there yet. The turbo whine was a rumor until he hit the starter. Then it wasn't a sound so much as a presence, low, distant like a train in fog, and the airfield shivered awake. Across the channel, a German pilot named Karl Falk sipped ersatz coffee from a dented aluminum mug and laughed. Jageschwader 26 called the P-47 a flying beer barrel. Too slow to climb, too heavy to turn, too far from home to matter. "Look at their cowlings," a Staffel camarade said, thumbing through a crumpled airplane spotter card. "It's all engine. They think horsepower is tactics." Carl grinned at that and tugged his leather cap tighter, the leather creaking gently like a well-used saddle. "Horsepower is fear," he said. "One pass, breakdown gone." He mimed a heavy dive with his hand and a heavy laugh with his throat. The men around him, thin from ration bread and sausages that were more bread than sausage, laughed along. Their laughter echoed off the chalk hangar walls and drifted into the coastal wind that smelled of kelp and petrol. They had reasons to be sure. BF-109GS and FW-190 as climbed like corks popping from a bottle. They were serious knives in an experienced hand. The Americans were new to the big room over Europe. Their radios squawked with static. Their escort ranges barely reached the French coast. Their bombers came, the fighters turned back, and the wolf pack of the Luftwaffe fell on the herds. Still, the jug kept arriving in more numbers. Briefing at Debden ran on the smell of chalk dust and kept time by the clatter of plodding sticks. A lieutenant colonel from 8 Fighter Command jabbed at arrows sketched on the continent-shaped board. "Rouen marshalling yard. H-hour plus 60. We pick up the fortress's feet wet. Escort to coast in. First relief before the IP. You're not to chase. Hippiat, do. Not. Chase. You're to keep the Hun off the heavies." There were mutters. Pilots on a chase. They come from crop dusters and barnstormers and pre-war mail routes. Pursuit is not a part of them. It is them. "Sir," Jack said, careful with his voice, "our radios, last time." "We know," the colonel said. "Signal section assures US TR/T interference is sorted. We've rerouted the turbo's electrics, new HF filters on the dynamo. You will be on Channel C except for emergency on A. You will not dogfight over the Pas de Calais. You will bring your ships back." After brief, Jack sat on the grass beside the belly of his jug and wrote home on V-mail. "It's a big airplane, Ma. Must look like a barn door to a German. Don't fret. They tell us she dives like the wrath of God. If I keep the sun right and the speed up, it's a fair fight." When he folded the flimsy and licked the gummed edge, it tasted of medicinal glue and pennies. He slid it into his pocket and went to meet 8 Brownings. It started like a chore and became a ritual. Form up over the Thames estuary. Climb to 20,000 while the turbo sang and the slipstream rattled the canopy. Rendezvous with bombers that looked like clumsy gray geese and smelled of sweat and coffee and courage. Set a curve ahead of the stream, 1 flight above, another below, 2 more to the side. Be a roof, be a wall, be an unphotographed threat. Wolf leader, this is Iron 1, Tally Bandits 10 o'clock high. Angels 25, came the calm voice from a squadron that had learned calm from RAF veterans. Jack craned his neck until it hurt. Contrails scribbled in the blue. The sun, betrayed, found silver in every drop tank, every canopied bead. "Hold your horses," Zemke said. The 56 Fighter Group commander was 2 groups away, but shaped the sky like weather. "Don't go uphill. Let him come. Jug pilots, listen. We're not here to tour with Focke-Wulfs. We're here to ruin their plan." Jack breathed slower. They always taught breathing right before they taught shooting. He felt the 4-bladed prop chew thick air. He felt the weight of .50 caliber belts in his wings. He felt the engine's heat through his boots. He watched the specs swell. Birds into airplanes, airplanes into choices. The first FW-190s came in from the sun, high, slashing for the bombers. Jack angled up toward them without losing his climb. Catch them after they fired on the way out, when they were fat with speed and less inclined to look over their shoulders. "Clear high right," someone called. "Brake," someone else said, and a Ford in the lead element lost an engine, smoke marking it for Wolves. "Two's with you," said Eddie Morales, Jack's wingman, the steadiness in his voice like a hand on a shoulder. "Hold, hold," Jack said, and the words tasted like copper. Then the world found a tempo. A 190's radial flashed past with the yellow nose of a staffel captain. He fired at a fortress and rolled to dive away. Jack rolled inverted and let gravity grow the jug's speed to an unholy thing. The P-47 did not so much dive as plummet with intention. The turbo howled like a siren that had learned to sing harmony. The altimeter unwound. The German filled the ring of Jack's K-14 gun sight, black cross, clean canopy, white fumes streaming from a spent gun. Jack's thumb found the butterfly trigger. 8 Brownings did not bark. They saw the air. Tracer stitched under the Focke-Wulf's wing first, then across the root, then found the cockpit with a harsh, convincing punctuation. The 190 hunched up, as if trying to bring its shoulders to its ears. It rolled away and down, smoke drawn out like a scarf tugged by giant hands. Jack followed, a heartbeat too long, felt the weight of the Earth's pull, then let go, leveled, and climbed. The heavy jug still climbed if you treated it not as a dancer, but as a pole vaulter. Energy in, arc, recover. "Egress! Egress!" came a call from the bombers. Flak began to paint the sky with smudged black daisies. It smelled like rotten eggs and hot iron. The formation turned for home. 1 fortress down, 3 smoking, gunners peering through plexiglass blister riddled with spider cracks. "Nice work," Eddie said, as if they'd finished a fence. "Save the congratulations for Debden," Jack said, checking the temperature gauges that measured panic in degrees Fahrenheit. Oil pressure steady. Cylinder head temp grumpy, but not scolding. He stole a glance at the channel. It was exactly the right size, the size that turned fighters into escorts and escorts into ferries. Carl Falk did not see the first salvo that took his staffel camarade, only the falling silk and the small black inversion that happens when a man's life turns from noise to silence. He flattened out and felt the FW-190's BMW radial purr like a cat that has eaten well. He saw the suspect, a P-47 with the slabby cheeks of a bulldog and the posture of a heavyweight who doesn't mind being hit some. The American had pulled out early rather than see the dive to the end. Sensible. The 190 could climb back up, reset, choose. Rattenführer, brake left, Roger, radioed his wingman lens. "Negative," Carl said, calm. "Climb. We come from above." He had learned his flying over the channel when a Messerschmitt 109E still felt fresh and the Spitfires still felt young. He had learned that an enemy behind you is a problem. An enemy below you is a statistic. He dragged the stick gently, trading airspeed for altitude in a disciplined, almost tender parabolic. Below, the bomber stream turned, and with it turned the task. A string of P-47s repositioned, their bellies freckled with mud, their canopies glinting like an unblinking eye. Carl watched one, long drop tank like a pregnant belly, not jettisoned yet, slide across his sight picture. He pictured the heavy American cockpit, big enough for a man to pace in. He thought Riley and the big metrics of their war, gallons and guns. Jets, he set into the mask and rolled with a quick wrist and a firmer foot. The 190's ailerons answered like a bird's. He dropped into the American's high six and began to close. He could almost feel the murmur in the other pilot's scalp, that itch between the shoulder blades that says, "Not yet pain, but soon." The American must have felt it. The P-47 rolled right, lazily. It was a ruse. The jug looked slow in the roll until it wasn't, until a big shoulder came to help, until the wing loading and the strong center section gave you the surprise of a boulder that knows how to sidestep. The American snapped into a descending right-hand spiral, and Carl lost the clean firing line. He fired a measured burst anyway. Tracer went past the cockpit, green insults in a pale sky. He was about to call it off, climb again, reset the geometry, when the heavy shape below him leveled and, without warning, reared back into a climb that made poor sense for a jug. Carl frowned, tugged the throttle forward, and a fragment of memory rose like a bubble. Don't fight your enemy's strengths. Don't fly his airplane for him. He broke off and went up, but not fast enough. The P-47 had more in the bank than he credited, more energy from the long dive. It wasn't a turn, it was a curve with money behind it. He got away. This time, he was good at that. Back on the line, someone had written on the chalkboard, "Am I Fr lang Zeit, Americans for a long time?" There was a crude drawing of a barrel with wings. Carl wiped it off with his sleeve. "Children," he said, and made a joke he didn't feel. War isn't only above 10,000 feet. It lives in hangars and mess halls and funerals with no bodies. It lives in the pencil marks of crew chiefs who track cylinder changes like a farmer tracks rainfall. Debden's metal Quonset huts perfumed the night with hot bacon and cold tea. Jack lay on his cot and listened to a gamey phonograph sing about a brown-eyed girl from Indiana. Eddie snored on the other side of the plywood partition, a sound like a small motorcycle with a loose exhaust. Jack's hands remembered the trigger. In his head, the sight picture rewound, slowed, restored to clarity. He had seen the 190's canopy opalize for a second as the 8.50s threw a storm through it. He had not followed down to see a grave. He had level. He had climbed. He was learning that victory in this war sometimes looked like a choice not to go lower. It offended parts of him that grew up with dime novels. In the morning, the desert of the briefing board had new arrows. Schweinfurt and Regensburg whispered like a rumor in the hallways. The 8th Air Force planners had choirboy looks and wolfish maps. Escort range was a prayer with math attached. The first P-47s had turned back before the heavies needed them most. That had been a lesson. Today there were drop tanks, finned tin teardrops under the wings and belly that sloshed as you turned. Not always reliable. Sometimes they failed to drain, sometimes they iced. But sometimes they worked, and when they did, the jug reached farther than the men who had mocked it in the barracks thought it could. "You jettison at altitude before the scrap," the colonel said. "If you land with them, I'll personally write you up for attempted murder." "They leak like my Uncle Pete," someone said. "Your Uncle Pete needs a different doctor," the colonel said. Laughter loosened the room. "Remember, climb/climb. You have 8 reasons to keep it disciplined. Do not mix it up with 109s over their fields. If you must, do it over ours." Jack ran his hand down the seam of the belly tank. It was cold, condensation forming beads that trembled with the engine's idle. He felt oddly tender toward the ugly tin egg. It promised him a few more minutes near the bombers. It promised a longer goodbye to the bad guys. Schweinfurt was a blackjack game the house should never have allowed. Ball bearings were the bones of machines. If you could break that, you could make the German war machine limp. But to break it, you had to send your bombers deeper than your escorts liked, and keep them in the air longer than nerves liked. They launched at first light, a tongue of aluminum and cocky prayers. The P-47s took station with them, and the contrails finished painting the sky. Over Belgium, the Luftwaffe came like someone had kicked an anthill. The first passes were clean and fast, right angles through the formation, disciplined, like men who had drilled this pattern on a sandy French beach with a stick. The second passes were uglier and closer and more expensive. Jack saw a fortress turn into a burning astrolabe and felt his breath change, even as his hands moved of their own accord. "Eddie, high right," he called. To 109s, nose up. The two Messerschmitts were like sleek knives with greedy noses. Jack rolled and dove at the trailing one. The leader was already moving to break away after his firing pass. And for a moment, he allowed the jug to be what the German had seen: slow, heavy, doomed. The 109 came a hair lower than he should have. Jack reversed with all the muscle in the side of his neck and the leverage of a big wing, and invited the German into a scissors he didn't want. A jug doesn't want a flat scissors. But this wasn't flat. It was slightly descending with just enough room to turn energy into options. The German blinked first, straightened to dive. "Now," Jack said, and pushed the nose down enough to make the sight a green cathedral. He touched the butterfly, and the Browning scythed. Tracer arced into the thin rear fuselage of the 109 the way rain finds a leak in a roof. The prop stopped. The canopy ejected in a flash of white, and for a moment the pilot hung there in sky and then fell. The parachute opened, a surrender writ small, and Jack looked away. He had other promises to keep. They kept the bombers to the IP, then to the turn, and then the tanks were dry and the math grew small in the mirror. They had to leave. They had to leave while friends were still up there. That was the part no one had put on the recruiting poster. On the way home, 3 jugs with dry tanks and 3 engines that had begun to feel bored found themselves looking at the thin blue line of the channel like stranded men look at a lights on shore. Eddie tapped his gauges and swore gently. "Pull the prop back," Jack said. "Lean it until the engine complains, and then give it a sip more. No heroics. We're sailors now." They made the coast with the needles kissing the wrong side of their faces. They came over Debden's hedgerows like limping hounds, and when Jack cut the mags and the big prop wound down, the silence felt like a cathedral after the choir had gone. In the debrief, a young captain with 2 clean a shirt ticked off the boxes. Observed flak, heavy, accurate over target. Observed fighter opposition, strong, coordinated. Claims? Jack hesitated. 1 probable, 1 damaged. He watched the captain write it down with the same attention with which someone writes a grocery list. He signed the sheet like he was signing for a package. He felt hollowed, used. He went outside to smoke and didn't light the cigarette. "Zemke wants you," Eddie said. "He's got a notion." Hub Zemke had a farmer's face and a chess player's eyes. He'd been thinking about how to be in 10 places at once. The small board on the table had ovals and lines like a football coach's playbook. "We can't be thick around the bombers all the time," he said. "We don't have the range to parcel ourselves like that. But we can be thin in the right place at the right time." He tapped arcs on the map with a pencil. "We'll send elements out in a fan ahead of the stream. Not far. Far enough to sniff where the interceptors are climbing. They hit them as they form up, make them late to their own party. Then we slide back to the bombers. Call it," he frowned, then shrugged, "call it whatever you like. But fly it." Jack traced the arcs with his eyes and felt something unknot between his shoulders. "They'll say we're abandoning the heavies," he said. "They'll say many things," Zemke said. "But if you can make the enemy miss their timing, the bombers won't need you for the piece you just bought them." His finger tapped the paper again, twice, once for the idea, once to nail it down. They tried it 2 days later. The fan reached forward like a hand over a stove, feeling for heat. They found it where the Luftwaffe gathered by habit over a particular woodlet and a church spire with a red roof. For 190s had just formed into a swarm, neat and German, when the jugs fell on them from a bully's favorite angle, quietly and together. It wasn't a fur ball. It was a push, then a step back, then another push. When Karl Falk rolled in to help his comrades, he found the table had been laid wrong. There were Americans above, behind, and the road home looked crowded. He got away again. He was good at that. He landed at Abbeville with his fuel warning light glowering and walked into the dispersal hut with a face like smoked glass. "They're learning," he said, and for the first time he did not laugh when someone drew a barrel with wings. Winter came to both sides of the channel with a particular gray that dulled the edges of things. Jack learned to fly instruments across a sky that had no horizon and a landscape that lay to you about what it was. The Jug's cockpit steamed if your mask slipped. Your glove stuck to the throttle like a tongue to winter iron. But the turbo didn't care. It spun like the steady note on a pipe organ, and the airplane did what you told it as long as you told it the right way. In January, they started talking about a week where everything would happen at once. The 8th Air Force would go for aircraft plants, ball bearing plants, assembly plants. The RAF would hit at night, the Americans by day, and the idea was to sing in harmony until the other side's choir couldn't find the tune. Jack stood at the map and felt the math in his knees. He also felt the paper cut on the side of his index finger from where he'd brushed a fresh printed diagram. And this small sting made everything suddenly real in a way briefings rarely did. A paper cut is honest. It doesn't ask if you're brave. It just hurts. "Big week," someone said, and the name stuck because it sounded like something a boxing promoter would say to sell tickets. The Luftwaffe didn't buy tickets. They showed up in force. On the second day, a Heinkel came in with a spotlight under its belly, hunting. P-47s hunted back. Above Oldenburg, Jack and Eddie fell on a gaggle of 109s like a teacher who has caught boys dipping pigtails in ink. The first pass scattered them. The second pass shot one down. The third pass saw a brown-green 190 roll in from nowhere and send a seam of cannon shells across Eddie's left wing. Fabric hung like a torn apron. "I'm hit," Eddie said amiably, as if describing rain. "But she flies." "Head west," Jack said. "I have her high." A 109 tried to take the long curve onto Eddie's 6. Jack came from above, pure gravity and 8 intentions. He fired short to walk the stream on. The German snapped away. Good pilot, good nerves, but 1.50 caught his radiator. The 109 trailed a white ribbon and floated down with a certain sad grace. The pilot got out and stood on the wing and shook his fist at the sky. Jack saw him for a second, small, angry, human, and looked away. He was keeping a promise to someone else this second. Eddie made it to the coast on a wing that whistled like a kettle. The engine coughed, then settled. He put the Jug down at an emergency strip in East Anglia, rolled to a stop, and sat in the steam of his own fear until it cooled to something like belief. That night, in the mess, the talk was not loud. When you've been near the edge, you sip your tea as if you can finish your life with a few more quiet swallows. Jack wrote another V-mail and did not seal it. He stared at the line. "Tell Dad, I finally respect his old pickup. She always brought us home," and grinned despite the ache. He sealed it then because he wanted someone in Indiana to see that line. Somewhere in France, in a drafty wooden barracks, Carl Falk pinned a new black hash mark under the silver wreath on his tunic. He did it without ceremony, as if he were mending a cuff. He had 20-something victories now, a number that made men hush when he entered a room. It should have tasted sweeter. It didn't. The all-tag angst, everyday fear, had crept in. He met a train one afternoon and watched children climb out with cardboard tags around their necks. A girl in a red coat stared at his flight boots until he felt ashamed of leather. He flew the next day with a kind of fury that did not help him. He mistook courage for impatience and found himself low and fast and in front of a P-47 with a white nose and a pilot who liked to count. The Jug opened up and the air turned to gravel. Carl rolled and dived and ran into a river valley where the frost made the fields look like linen. The American broke off, good discipline again, and Carl lived by the width of a bad decision someone else had made. Back at Abbeville, he wrote to a woman whose letters he no longer answered faithfully. "The Americans are flying big and heavy," he wrote, "but not stupid. They are harder to frighten than the British were. They talk on the radio like men who already know the next sentence. Their airplanes can take a hit and keep all that metal, still believing in flight. I find I must respect them, which I resent. He didn't send the letter. He tore it up and put the pieces in the coal stove, where they turned to ghosts. It came to a point under a high, thin cold over the Ardennes, the kind of cold that makes your breath a coin that buys you more breath. Jack and Eddie led a four-ship that had drawn high cover while the main squadron worked closer to the bombers. A dozen black specks appeared at 1 o'clock high, then multiplied like gnats gather around a horse. The radio was polite and firm. Wolf 3 tally. Angels 26. Looks like a Staffel and friends. Pick their stragglers, Jack said. Short bursts. Don't get target fixated. Remember you're out. He turned toward the sun and felt the jug shiver with eagerness. The Brownings chattered, and the barrels began their hot iron smell inside the wings. A 190 with a checkerboard cowling crossed his sight, and he sent a tight string of slugs through its starboard wing root. The canopy came off, the pilot bailed, the airplane rolled over and went away. He did not count it yet. He did not have time. Eddie called, strained. Brake, Jack. High left. Jack rolled hard. A 109 dove across his last sky with a cannon flash that he felt more than saw. A hole opened in the jug's starboard wing like a mouth that had something rude to say. The airplane lurched and then, good girl, found its balance again. I'm okay, he said, breath gone shallow. He looked down to find a place to be not shot for 5 seconds. That's when he saw the other jug, green tail, fresh paint, low, bleeding glycol in a gorgeous, terrible streamer. The pilot was limping west, and a 190 sat on his high six like a bad memory. Jack's mouth filled with the taste of pennies again. Eddie, he said quietly, cover me. He rolled, dove, and felt the jug become something other than weight. A story, maybe about a boy from Indiana who had learned to let gravity help him do something righteous. The 190 grew in the sight, not from his hands, but from time. He let a little. He breathed out. He pressed the butterfly. The .50s poured a river he could almost see the current in. The German flinched. He always flinched, even the best did, and rolled away, leaking smoke. Jack eased off. The green-tailed jug waggled his wings, the universal language of thanks at 400 miles an hour. Then someone said, almost conversational, 2 more, high 12. And the sky above Jack turned to rivets and decisions. He pulled, felt the onset of the gray at the edge of his eyes, and pushed his left boot like it was the last honest thing he owned. The jug answered, slower than a spit, faster than a promise, and the shape in his windscreen became a BF-109 with an Ace's hand-painted victory wreath under the cockpit. The German rolled inverted for a split S. Jack could follow him down and hope his wing didn't part company where the cannon shell had chewed it. Or he could pull up, cede the dive, risk losing him, keep his airplane for the next promise. For half a breath, he wanted to be the man who followed. For the other half, he remembered the briefing, the math, the way 8 Brownings were only as good as the discipline that told them when not to bark. He raised a nose. The 109 fell away and lived to be someone else's problem or someone else's regret. Jack, Eddie said, and the question was too big for the channel. I'm with you, Jack said. And that was the right answer, and he believed himself. Somewhere below them, a line of black puffs marked a flak battery that hated everyone equally. Somewhere above them, in a clean blue air no man had ever breathed, choices waited. Carl Falk, a few miles away in the same sky, pointed his 190's nose toward a knot of contrails and thought of nothing but angles. He had heard something new in the American radios lately. Not arrogance, not fear. Tempo. He would have to match it or die out of tune. He rolled. The morning they briefed for Leipzig, frost crusted the pier steel planking and made the jugs look like they'd been rolled in sugar. The room hummed with the kind of quiet that happens when a lot of men pretend not to think about odds. Targets are aviation plants. The colonel said, pointer tapping circles on Saxony like a woodpecker on an old tree. Flak will be heavy. Fighter cover will be coordinated. You are to fly the fan forward, Mr. Zemke's bright idea, then fall back to the stream. Don't get greedy. You get greedy, you get court-martialed posthumously, which is a kind of lonely. A few laughs, thin but welcome. Jack looked at Eddie and drew a line in the air with his finger. Out and out. Eddie nodded. They didn't need words for what they decided months ago. Cover first, credit last. They launched into a sky the color of a gun barrel. The turbo sang its reedy note. The prop chopped mist into steam. The oxygen mask smelled like rubber bands and metal. With belly and wing tanks hung like tin fruit. The jug was a plow horse, not a racehorse, but it would go the distance if you didn't yank the reins. At 25,000, contrails knitted a roof over Belgium. Ahead and above, where German interceptors always liked to build their ambushes, the air had a new texture, like heat shimmering over a road though the temperature was below freezing. Jack slid the flight out on the fan, 2 minutes ahead of the bomber stream. It felt like stepping out from behind a shield. Tally, Eddie said, even professional. 11 o'clock high, 12 plus. Wolf 3, hold altitude, Jack replied. Do not climb to play their game. They come down, we go sideways and up. We are not here to decorate their gun cameras. The 190s slid into view, dark crosses, clean canopies, discipline written in geometry. Jack let them commit. They pointed their noses down to dive through where the fortresses would be in 60 seconds and hit a four-ship of P-47s instead. The first pass was all angles. Jack's burst cut across a 190's right wing like a carpenter's chalk line. Eddie's guns chewed at another's tailplane. The German jinked, saved it, lost timing. The second element finished the ambush, short, ugly bursts, then a coordinated break that turned the Luftwaffe's downhill slide into a downhill skid. The fan worked when you were ahead of the music. For 30 seconds, the bombers flew into a quieter sky. Back to the herd, Jack said, and they slid to the side of the stream as if they'd never left. Leipzig itself rose in brown smoke and black puffs. Fortresses staggered in turbulence made of explosions. Jack found himself timing breaths between flak bursts, as if his lungs could be polite to the German gunners. A 109 came in from the sun, a cold flash with teeth. Jack rolled under, put 2 seconds of .50 across its radiator, watched the white streamer bloom like breath on a frozen morning. The pilot stayed with the airplane too long, then surrendered to a chute. Jack looked away. Radio. A pulse of calm and panic mixed. Iron 2, low 9. Break. Break. I've lost number 3. Feathering. I see you. With you. It was terrifying and ordinary at once, like a storm on a farm. You still had to shut the chicken coop, while lightning took an interest in your roof. The tanks ran dry on schedule, which was a blessing and a sentence. Jack punched the belly drop. It clanged away, and suddenly the jug felt less like furniture, more like flight. They nursed the wing tanks to the edge of the escort line, then turned west with a regret that tasted like tin. They landed to the sound of sheet metal pinging as it cooled. In debrief, the captain's pencil raced to catch the war before it evaporated. Claims and probables went onto a board where a chalk eraser could erase bravado and memory with equal ease. Fan bought them 2 minutes at least, Jack told Zemke, who had arrived mid-debrief like weather coming in from the west. 2 minutes multiplied by 300 bombers is the kind of math I like, Zemke said. Now the bad news. The Huns changing his clocks. They're massing lower, rolling in staggered sections, trying to bait the fan too far out. Tomorrow will be late on purpose. Make them swing twice. Short leash, Jack. If I see you chasing down to the deck, I'll have your prop hung on the mess wall as a chandelier. Wouldn't match the curtains, Eddie said. Zemke grinned, despite himself. In Abbeville's half snow, half mud, Carl Falk took the measure of his staffel with an eye sharpened by scarcity. New boys with good hands on the stick and not enough hours. old hands with the wrong kind of quiet in them. Fuel was a rumor. Spares were fiction. They had learned to put aircraft up on sawhorses and coax one flyable machine out of 3 with prayer and wire. Morale lived now in specifics. A hot bowl of soup, a photograph that had survived 2 moves, a cylinder that sealed on the second try. He still had his touch. Over Leo, he took a thunderbolt in a descending spiral when its pilot hung on a second too long, trusting weight to make a trap. Carl respected the man's discipline. He didn't follow down into the flak, didn't try to turn the 190's high roll rate into a party trick. He lived. That respect, the reluctant kind, had become familiar. But the air felt different. The Americans were showing up where he didn't schedule them. Their radios sounded like a metronome. They were fighting to buy moments, not glory. And their 8-gun bursts cut airplanes not in half, which is rare, but in certainty, which is worse. The night before what they'd soon call Big Week's last push, Carl wrote nothing and slept in his flight jacket like it was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. They launched into a sky that was too blue to trust. The plan was harmony, RAF at night, 8th by day, a tempo without intermissions. The P-47s led the escort until the P-51s could meet and relieve. The 51s were the long legs of the tune now, but the jugs were the drum that started each song. Loud, reliable, hard to ignore. Jack felt the difference a D-22 with paddle blade prop made when he pushed the throttle. Climb was less of a penance. The bubble canopy gave him a horizon that didn't lie. The R-2800 thrummed with that slightly drunk bravado that made crew chiefs pat the cow like a dog that brought you a pheasant and ate the feet. Fan on time, he said. 2 flights out. 2 with the herd. They found a cluster of 109s laddering up through a hole in the clouds. The first pass worked. The second pass met a German counter they hadn't seen before, decoys. A finger 4 slid into a shallow dive, bait for a chase. Above and abeam, 2 more waited to roll in on the chasers. Hold your horses, Jack said to air that was already full of shooting. Discipline. If it looks too easy, it's too easy, Eddie finished, and they both broke high instead of down. The decoy trick fell flat. The ambushers rolled in on air, and 4 jugs arrived from noon with speed to sell. For 10 seconds the sky sounded like sheet metal torn by giant hands. The 109s fell away. One trailed smoke. One didn't trail anything at all because it was suddenly not an airplane, but parts of an idea. Back, Jack said. We're late enough. They fell into the bomber stream like old friends falling into a familiar argument. The 88s below wrote black punctuation in the air. Fortress waist gunners stitched the sky with green tracers like men sewing a sail in a gale. Jack saw a B-17 with a grapefruit-sized hole where a man should be and did not let his mind attach a name. He found fixed fired. The Brownings ate belts and turned them into a language the enemy understood. And yet, when they turned home, the German fighters were still there to scold them for leaving. 2 190s slid in on the high arc. Eddie took the high one. Jack guarded the low. The 190 below tried the old trick, faint climb, then rudder kick into a snap roll and dive. Jack didn't buy. He rolled, matched, kept energy weighted. Waiting is the part you learn late. The 190 blinked first, showed too much belly in the sun. Jack squeezed a 1-second burst. The right wing root sprouted sparks. The canopy flashed. The German rolled away, low, fast, desperate. Jack didn't follow into the flak. He watched the man go, a black bead on linen fields, and held his altitude like someone holding a door for friends. Back at Debden, they counted holes and didn't count friends. In a mess that night, the phonograph needle found the groove on a favorite and talked about a Midwestern river. Eddie drank 1 beer slow and then put the empty bottle sideways on the table, a private signal they'd invented to mean enough. Jack nodded and matched it. I thought about following him down, he said quietly. I know, Eddie said. I thought about watching you do it. Glad I didn't see that picture. They sat and listened to other men play cards badly. Outside, the wind chords on the tents sang an off-key hymn. Carl Staffel lived the counterfan for a week and then watched it die. The Americans had learned too quickly. Their fan became flex. Their ambush became refusal. The 51 showed up early one day and late the next, and the sense that you could break their clock like a toy evaporated. He still had his eyes. He still had his hands. Over the Ardennes, he hunted low, bad habit born of necessity, pushing through valleys where flat crews were too cold to be accurate. He found, at last, the picture he wanted, a pair of jugs returning west at 1,500 feet, one limping, one shepherding. He came out of the sun that barely warmed anything and put the nose of the 190 in the right place. He could see the shepherd's pilot turn his head as if listening for a song behind him. For a crack of time, he was the man his old self remembered. Angles, patience, a burst that would not be hurried. He fired. His shells crossed the shepherd's starboard wing and tore a line of holes that whistled like a tea kettle boiling too long. The jug staggered and then, maddeningly, settled. The American didn't break away. He tightened onto the limper's sixth like a man stepping closer to a friend in a crowd. Carl rolled to follow and felt the 190's controls take on a heaviness that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with fatigue. His and the airplane's. The American pulled a shallow climbing turn that was criminally modest. Carl matched, impatient, and that was the door Jack had hoped he'd open. Eddie's voice was a calm lid on a boiling pot. "You have him, Jack." Jack didn't feel like he had anyone. He felt like he had borrowed 1 second from fortune and might owe interest for the rest of his life. He led the 190's arc by a yard, then a half yard, then 3 feet more than that. He pressed the butterfly. 8.50s filled the world with a particular persuasive truth. The tracers walked the 190 from tail to canopy. Glass milked, paint lifted, the prop bit air and then bit less. Karl's Airplan assured. He didn't think, he knew. He crushed the canopy latch, let the slipstream punch the greenhouse away, rolled the airplane onto its back, unlatched the belt, fell into gray, and then into blue, and then into white that opened like a flower. The parachute jerked time back into him. The ground below was a patchwork, snow and hedges, brown in fields, red roof, black road. He drifted toward a hedgerow. A British ACAC crew in greatcoats watched him come down with the impassive curiosity of men who have seen strangers drop out of the sky before breakfast. When he hit, he rolled as he'd been taught in another century. His ankle objected. Hands, thick gloves, unfamiliar English curses, took his shoulders and sat him on an ammo crate. A tin mug of tea appeared in his hand. It was hot and sweet and tasted like surrender. Jack circled once low, made eye contact across 300 yards and 1,000 decisions. He waggled his wings, small, respectful, and climbed west. The British gunner watched the jug go and spat into the snow. "Big bugger, that," he said to nobody in particular. "Good show." Carl looked down at the mug. It steamed. He found, to his surprise, that he could taste the sugar for the first time in months. By spring, the war had tilted. The Luftwaffe still bit, but not with the jaw it had. The Americans learned routine without letting it turn to laziness. The jug stayed in the fight, even as Mustangs took the far escort. They went lower, meaner, smarter. They cut rail lines, cratered marshalling yards, tore into flak towers in the last seconds before bombers arrived. They began to carry bombs of their own. 500-pounders under a wing, another under the belly, and discovered they could lay a string of destruction with the same implacable patience they'd learned in the escort game. Rocket stubs appeared on the wings, ugly, useful. Jack flew a D-28 with a bubble canopy, so clean it made England look like a painting. He learned to read roads the way he'd learned to read contrails. Trains tried to hide in tunnels. Trucks tried to cuddle against hedges. The jug turned the hedges into unconvincing actors. When 8 Brownings came low, wagons burst like overripe fruit. Not a pretty metaphor, but accurate. He hated that work more and loved it more. It shortened wars. Eddie became a flight leader with a voice other men borrowed for courage. He had a scar on his left forefinger where a hot casing had landed during an engine run-up months before. He rubbed it sometimes, a habit that looked like prayer. On a day when the world smelled of thawed mud and gasoline, they hit a rail yard that had been repaired too quickly. The first pass put bombs into switching points. The second pass stitched the yard with .50, turning boxcars into noise. Flack walked up the track at them with the patience of a farmer hoeing a row. On the egress, a 109 popped up from a reedy pond like a heron where you didn't expect it. He was good, rolled into Eddie's 6 with an angle that looked like handwriting. Jack didn't think. He dove under Eddie, pulled vertical, hung on the prop just long enough to bring the ring sight onto the 109's nose, and fired half-second. That's all he had left in the belts on the right wing, half a second. It was enough. The 109 twitched, then wilted into the reeds. The pilot climbed out, tiny wet furious. Eddie saluted him with 2 fingers and kept going. Mercy and murder ride the same airplane in war. You just try to keep the mercy in the cockpit and the murder in the guns. That night, Jack dreamed of Indiana rain. He woke to English rain on the hut roof and smiled. Close enough. Carl spent the last year of the war behind wire, first near the coast and then inland. The Americans were scrupulous. The British were polite. The Red Cross was real. He found a pencil and wrote a letter he finally sent. I laughed at a machine, he wrote, and learned I should have respected the men. The P-47 is not elegant, but it is honest. It tells you what it is in the first second. Strong, unwilling to be hurried, unforgiving of bad choices, generous to good ones. When 8 of its guns speak at once, they make a sentence that ends arguments. I hope never to hear that sentence again. I hope to see the men who flew them walk away from war as if from a bad landing. Bruised, perhaps, but alive. He didn't know the names of the men he met. He didn't need to. When the war moved past the Rhine, Debden's Quonsets grew quieter. Some boys rotated home. Some went missing in ways that make sentences too hard to finish. The field cook replaced powdered eggs with rail eggs, and everyone treated the yolks like gold. Zemke got a new maple pointer and stabbed it at new maps with the same intensity. He also took time to lean on a fence and watch a horse try to eat his sleeve. Commanders, like engines, need idle to run well. On a clear afternoon that smelled of cut grass and spilled 115/145 octane, the group lined up for a flyby. Jugs with kill marks and jugs with none. Jugs with patched skin and jugs with bare metal still proud. They went wheels up together, climbed into a sky that, for once, held no raiders, no schedules, no arguments. Over the field, they made one slow pass, 8 abreast. Like farm boys in Sunday suits walking down Main Street after church. On the pull-up, Jack looked down and saw crew chiefs waving greasy caps, mechanics with hands like second basemen's pumping fists, a corporal from mail call saluting like he hadn't meant to, and a kid from supply sobbing into a crate because his brother had been on a fortress that didn't come back last month, and this looked like grace. The war did not end in a neat paragraph. It wound down like an engine run to idle and then cut. The silence, after, felt wrong at first. Then it felt like oxygen without a mask, thin, startling, addictive. Jack went home to Indiana to find that fields still needed plowing and tractors still broke at the same place, and girls still smiled the way they had before newspapers ran maps on the front page every day. He flew crop dusters for a while, and then DC-3s that smelled of canvas and coffee. Some nights, he dreamed of a ring sight swelling until it filled the world. Some mornings he woke before dawn and felt around for a throttle that wasn't there. He kept in touch with Eddie because there was no good reason not to. They sent each other bad photographs of good fish and worse photographs of babies who grew into people with their own weather. In a drawer, he kept a V-mail that had come back to him with brown edges and creases like a map to a country that didn't exist. On its back, he had written after the war. She always brought us home. He meant the P-47. He meant the idea of it. He meant the men who stood in wet grass with safety wire between their teeth and kept the big girl honest. Years later, at a small air show where old men leaned on fences and young boys tried not to look too eager, a restored jug taxied out with its R2800 coughing to a smooth bass. Jack felt the sound in his ribs the way he used to. The pilot, a kid with clear eyes and good hands, ran the engine up and the prop wrote sun into arcs. The airplane leapt when freed. It climbed like a memory that wanted altitude before telling its story. Jack laughed, then didn't, then did again because the right to laugh had been earned. He watched it make a pass and roll and climb, and then, because the pilot had done his homework, push over into a dive that was not a dive but a sermon on gravity. When it pulled out, the speakers played a song about a brown-eyed girl from a place that could be anywhere. A man in a cap with a foreign accent stepped up beside him. "Good airplane," he said, as if pronouncing a verdict. His English had the sand of another language in it. Jack nodded. "Good enough," he said. German aces laughed. The man said, half smiling, how do you say? Until 8.50s opened up, Jack finished. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like a man telling the truth about weather. The man nodded and took off his cap. His hair was white. There was a thin white line on his wrist, rope-burn parachute risers, or it could have been anything. He looked at the jug, which shone as if it had been polished with memory, and for a second the two of them were the same age again, wearing oxygen masks that smelled like rubber and decision. They shook hands like men who both owed and had been paid. What changed when the laughter stopped? Tempo over theater. The P-47's crew's learned escort wasn't about duels. It was about timing. Zemke's fan, feeling ahead, ambushing form-ups, then sliding back, turned horsepower into minutes and minutes in a mission saved. Discipline over appetite. The jug thrived when flown like a banker, not a brawler. Dive smart, burst short, climb away, keeping out. 8 Brownings are only as deadly as the pilot's refusal to spend them stupidly. Ruggedness as strategy. The R2800, the thick wing, the huge turbo system. These weren't accidents. They let men come home with holes, which let units keep experience, which turned groups into schools that taught survival. Range is doctrine. Drop tanks, paddle props, lean mixtures, and later Mustangs extended the roof. But the P-47 proved that with planning, you could move the escort line from the beach to the factory. Roles evolve. When P-51s took the deepest escort, the jug didn't retire. It descended. Rail cuts, flak suppression, armored columns. Its 8.50s and bomb racks shortened the war in the last cruel miles. Respect replaces myth. The jokes about flying beer barrels died in the sound of 8 guns. What stayed was a sober respect between men who had learned that an airplane is merely a shape around a choice. If you stand close to a P-47 today, the cowling seems too big and the wing too thick and the landing gear too proud of its own size. But touch the skin, warm in sun, cool in hangar shade, and you feel the purpose hammered into it. Somewhere over Europe, a boy from Indiana and a man from Abbeville learned the same lesson from opposite ends of 8 barrels. Laugh if you like, but listen when a machine tells you what it was built to do. And when it opens up, believe it.